40,000 workers, every single morning, filing through those gates, building cars so expensive, so perfect, so impossibly beautiful that kings bought them, that presidents rode in them, that Hollywood stars refused to be seen in anything else. And then one day, silence. Not gradual, not slow. Silence. The machines stopped, the lights went out, and 3.5 million square feet of the most advanced factory ever built on American soil was just left. Doors open, tools on the floor, the ghosts of 40,000 workers still echoing off the concrete walls. What happened inside the Detroit Packard plant is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of American industry. A story of ambition so enormous it seems impossible, a collapse so total it seems impossible, and a legacy so dark, so haunting, so deeply American that it became a symbol recognized across the entire world. This is not just the story of a factory. This is the story of a dream that built a nation and then burned it down from the inside. And trust me, by the time we get to what happened in those final years, what they found inside those walls when it was all over, you will not believe this was real. Stay with me, because this story is unlike anything I have ever told. And if you're new here, this channel is dedicated to the stories of the world's most legendary factories, the rise, the glory, the collapse. Subscribe, because we have stories coming that will absolutely blow your mind. Let's go back to the very beginning, back to a moment that almost never happened. It is the summer of 1898. A young mechanical engineer named James Ward Packard is standing on a street in Cleveland, Ohio. He has just bought himself a brand new Winton automobile, one of the most advanced cars in America at the time. He paid $1,000 for it, which in 1898 is an almost incomprehensible amount of money, the equivalent of roughly $35,000 today. He drove it home, and it broke down, multiple times. James Packard was not the kind of man who accepted this quietly. He wrote a letter to Alexander Winton, the founder of the Winton Motor Car Company, listing every single problem with the vehicle, every defect, every flaw. He wasn't being cruel. He was an engineer. He thought he was being helpful. Winton's response? He told Packard essentially, if you think you can do better, go ahead and try. And James Packard looked at that letter, and he decided that yes, he absolutely could do better. Within a year, working alongside his brother William Dowd Packard and their business partner George Lewis Weiss, James had built his first automobile in Warren, Ohio, a one-cylinder buggy-type vehicle, simple by modern standards, revolutionary by the standards of 1899. That first car had a problem with its ignition timing, and so James Packard invented an automatic spark control to fix it, the company's very first patent, filed before they had even properly organized the business. That right there tells you everything you need to know about the Packard mentality. They didn't work around problems. They invented solutions. Between 1899 and 1903, James and William produced 400 cars from their Warren, Ohio factory, 400 hand-built, every single one, at a time when most Americans had never even seen an automobile. The cars were extraordinary. Word spread, and eventually, word reached a man named Henry Bourne Joy. Now, Henry Bourne Joy was not a car mechanic. He was not an engineer. He was something potentially more dangerous than either of those things. He was a wealthy Detroit businessman from one of the city's most powerful families. And in 1901, while visiting New York City, he encountered a Packard automobile for the first time. He bought one. And then he visited the Packard brothers in Warren, Ohio. And when he saw what was being built there, the quality, the precision, the ambition, something clicked in his mind. Joy went back to Detroit. He assembled a group of investors, all of them from the city's wealthiest and most powerful families, names like Newberry, Alger, McMillan, Ferry, old Detroit money, serious Detroit money. They renamed the company the Packard Motor Car Company in 1902. They elected James Packard as president, and then they made Henry Bourne Joy the general manager. And then they made the decision that would change everything. They moved the company to Detroit. Now, before we talk about what happened in Detroit, I want you to understand something about what Packard was already becoming. Because by 1903, Packard had already done something that almost no other car company in the world had done. They had invented the modern steering wheel. Think about that for a moment. Before Packard, automobiles were steered with a tiller, a lever, like a boat. James Packard looked at that system and said, "This is wrong, this is inefficient, this is dangerous," and he replaced it with a wheel. Every car you have ever been in, every road trip you have ever taken, every time you have turned a corner in an automobile, you are living in a world that James Packard helped create. That's who we're talking about here. But the steering wheel was just the beginning.
Packard was also building what they called the Gray Wolf, a four-cylinder aluminum racing car that became the first American race car available for public purchase. It went a mile a minute, 60 miles per hour, at a time when most people had never traveled faster than a horse. The Gray Wolf didn't just race, it won. And every time it won, the Packard name became more famous, more prestigious, more desirable. So when the company moved to Detroit in 1903, they weren't arriving as outsiders hoping to compete. They were arriving as conquerors, and they needed a factory worthy of that ambition. The man they hired to build it was named Albert Kahn. Now, if you don't know the name Albert Kahn, I need you to stop for a moment and appreciate what I'm about to tell you. Albert Kahn was arguably the most important industrial architect who ever lived. He didn't just design factories, he invented the concept of what a modern factory should be. Before Kahn, factories were dark, cramped, timber-framed boxes where men worked by candlelight and gas lamp, where floors collapsed, where fires consumed everything without warning. Kahn changed all of that. For Packard's first buildings on East Grand Boulevard, Kahn designed 10 structures, initially built from brick and timber, the standard of the era. But by 1906, when Packard added a 10th building to the complex, Kahn did something that had never been done before in the American automotive industry. He built it out of reinforced concrete. This was a revolution. Reinforced concrete meant open floor plans. It meant windows everywhere, floods of natural light pouring into spaces where workers could see what they were doing. It meant fire resistance.
It meant structures that could support incredible weight without internal columns breaking up the workspace. It meant for the first time that a factory could be designed around the process of building a car, rather than the process being squeezed into whatever space was available. Albert Kahn's reinforced concrete design for Packard Building No. 10 changed American industry forever. Within a decade, every major automobile manufacturer in the country was using Kahn's methods. He went on to design hundreds of factories, including many of the most important industrial facilities in American history. But it started here, right here, on East Grand Boulevard in Detroit. And now I want you to think about the scale of what was being built. In 1903, the Packard plant occupied 2 acres of floor space. By 1910, it covered over 33 acres. By 1916, it covered nearly 60 acres. Eventually, the complex would grow to over 80 buildings spread across 80 acres of Detroit's east side, 3.5 million square feet of factory space, more than any other automobile plant in the world. And at its absolute peak, 40,000 workers showed up here every single day. 40,000 people. That is not a factory. That is a city. But here's what I need you to understand about Packard, because this is the thing that separates them from every other car company of the era. Packard was not building transportation. Packard was building status. The company's slogan, "Ask the man who owns one," wasn't really an advertisement. It was a philosophy. It was an invitation. It was a statement that said, "Our product is so good, so far beyond anything you have ever experienced, that you don't need to take our word for it. Find someone who already owns one. Ask them."
They will tell you everything you need to know. And the people who owned Packards? In 1921, Warren G. Harding became the first United States president to be driven to his inauguration in an automobile. That automobile was a Packard. The Japanese royal family owned 10 Packard vehicles in 1931. Movie stars, industrialists, European royalty, heads of state. If you wanted to signal to the world that you had arrived, truly arrived, you bought a Packard. The Packard Twin 6, introduced in 1915 with a revolutionary V12 engine, became the car of kings, literally. Multiple royal families across Europe ordered them. The car offered a smoothness, a power,
a refinement that simply didn't exist anywhere else in the automotive world. And Packard kept innovating. First production V12 engine, first straight-8 engine, precision engineering that other manufacturers spent decades trying to replicate. The craftsmen at the Packard plant practiced more than 80 different trades. 80. This wasn't assembly line work in the Ford sense. This was craftsmanship. This was artistry. Every Packard that left this plant had been touched by dozens of skilled hands, each one a master of their specific discipline. This was the American Rolls-Royce. That is not an exaggeration. That was the comparison people made at the time. And this factory, this astonishing, sprawling, concrete cathedral on East Grand Boulevard, was where all of that magic happened.
Now, we need to talk about the war, because the war changes everything. When World War I broke out, Packard converted to war production faster than almost any other American manufacturer. The twin-6 V12 engine was adapted into the Liberty aircraft engine, described by historians as the single most important output of America's wartime industrial effort. Packard built the engines that flew the planes that helped win the First World War. And they did it again in the Second World War, more dramatically, more significantly, in ways that are almost impossible to overstate. I need you to pay attention here, because what I'm about to tell you is one of the most extraordinary chapters in this entire story. The year is 1940. Nazi Germany is advancing across Europe. Britain is fighting for survival, and one of the most critical weapons in the Allied arsenal is a fighter plane called the North American P-51 Mustang, perhaps the greatest fighter aircraft of World War II. The P-51 Mustang was fast, but it needed an engine worthy of its airframe, and that engine was the Rolls-Royce Merlin, a magnificent British power plant that produced over 1,400 horsepower. But Britain couldn't manufacture enough of them, so Rolls-Royce licensed the design to Packard. Right here, in this factory, on East Grand Boulevard in Detroit. The workers who had spent their careers building luxury automobiles for presidents and royalty set down their assembly tools and picked up precision instruments to manufacture one of the most complex and powerful aircraft engines in the world. By the end of the war, Packard had built 55,000 Merlin engines at this facility. 55,000.
The P-51 Mustang with the Packard-built Merlin engine became the plane that changed the course of the air war in Europe. It could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. German air defenses, which had been devastating Allied bombing runs, suddenly found themselves facing an opponent they couldn't beat. Historians will debate the details forever, but many argue that the P-51 Mustang with the Packard Merlin engine fundamentally altered the strategic situation in Europe and accelerated the end of the war. That engine was built here, in Detroit, by the same workers who built Packards for kings and presidents. Think about that the next time someone dismisses factory workers as unskilled labor. These people built the weapons that won the Second World War. When the war ended, the workers came home. The country was celebrating. America was booming, and Packard returned to building luxury automobiles. On paper, everything looked fine, but something had changed, something subtle, something dangerous. And here is where the story starts to turn dark. Because while Packard was off winning a world war, while their workers were building Merlin engines, and their brand name was associated with everything powerful and prestigious and American, the automotive world had shifted. The middle class was exploding. Millions of returning veterans wanted cars, affordable cars, cars that said, "I made it," without costing $10,000. And General Motors, with Cadillac, had figured out exactly how to sell luxury to that new mass market. With modern styling, with aggressive advertising, with annual model changes that made last year's car feel old even if it worked perfectly. Packard looked at this and faced a decision that would ultimately destroy them. Do we stay exclusive, or do we reach for a bigger market? They tried to do both. In 1935, Packard had introduced the 120, a more affordable model designed to attract middle-class buyers, while still carrying the Packard name. It sold beautifully. Over 50,000 units in its first year alone. It helped Packard survive the Depression. But it came at a cost. Because when the same name appears on a car that costs $1,200 and a car that costs several times that amount, what does the name really mean? Packard's wealthy, prestigious customer base began to whisper. The brand was being diluted. The exclusivity was fading. The thing that made Packard special, the fact that not just anyone could have one, was disappearing.
By the late 1940s, the media had given Packard cars unflattering nicknames. The designs were criticized as looking like bathtubs, like pregnant elephants, heavy, ungainly, old-fashioned in a country that was obsessed with sleek, modern, jet-age aesthetics. Packard kept changing, kept trying, kept struggling to find a way back. But here's the thing about luxury brands. Once you lose the perception of exclusivity, once people believe that anyone can own one, you cannot get it back by simply telling them otherwise. You have to earn it back, slowly, painfully, expensively. And Packard was running out of time. This is the moment in the story where I need you to really pay attention, because what happens next is a masterclass in how great companies destroy themselves. By the early 1950s, Packard was bleeding. Sales were declining. The company desperately needed to cut costs. And someone, somewhere in the executive suite, had what seemed like a brilliant idea. Why not merge with another struggling company and combine resources?
The company they chose was Studebaker. Now, Studebaker had its own problems, significant problems, high labor costs, inefficient production, and aging model lineup. But the theory was that together, pooling resources, sharing components, streamlining production, both companies could survive. In 1954, the merger happened. Packard effectively absorbed Studebaker, creating the Studebaker Packard Corporation. And almost immediately it became clear that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Studebaker's problems were far deeper than anyone had admitted during the negotiations. The labor costs were astronomical, the inefficiencies were systemic, the pension obligations were staggering. Packard hadn't rescued a struggling partner. Packard had swallowed a sinking ship. The merged company never turned a profit, not once. Packard's own resources were being consumed by Studebaker's problems. The money that should have gone into new Packard designs, new Packard engineering, new Packard innovations, was being poured into propping up a company that simply could not be saved. Because that's essentially what they were, Studebaker bodies with Packard badges. The craftsmanship was gone, the hand finishing was gone, the 80 trades were gone. The brand that had told the world to ask the man who owns one was now producing cars that the men who owned them were embarrassed to discuss. Almost 75% of Packard's customer base in the early 1950s were repeat buyers, people who had owned previous Packard models and kept coming back. But young buyers were coming at all. The survey showed it clearly. The brand was dying, and it knew it.
The board of directors, with an average age of 67 in the early 1950s, seemed unable or unwilling to make the aggressive moves that might have saved the company. Young executives couldn't reach positions of authority because old executives refused to retire. A company that had once led the industry through relentless innovation had become paralyzed by its own history. They brought in a new president, James Nance, recruited from the appliance manufacturer Hotpoint. He tried. He genuinely tried. He pushed for military contracts during the Korean War. He tried to restore the luxury-only positioning. He introduced the gorgeous 1953 Caribbean convertible, a stunning car, hand-built, genuinely worthy of the Packard name. But 750 units, that's how many they built. That's not a business strategy. That's a farewell gesture. In 1956, James Nance made the decision. Production would end at the Detroit factory on East Grand Boulevard. On June 25, 1956, the last true Packard rolled off the assembly line at this plant. 11,000 workers lost their jobs that day. 11,000. Not gradually, not over time, all at once. The gates closed, the machines went silent, the lights went out, and the greatest luxury automobile factory in American history was simply finished. The company would continue in name only, producing cars in South Bend, Indiana for 2 more years. But these were Studebaker bodies with Packard badges. The people who worked here, in this building, on this street, in this city, knew the truth. The last real Packard had already been built. The dream was over. But here is where the story takes a turn that nobody expected.
Because what happened to this building, to this magnificent concrete cathedral that Albert Kahn had designed and 40,000 workers had filled with the sound of industry, is a story that is in many ways even more extraordinary than the rise and fall of the company itself. After Packard left, Dozens of smaller businesses moved in. They rented portions of the vast complex, storage operations, light manufacturing, various small companies trying to survive in a changing economy. And Detroit was changing, fast. The automotive industry was suburbanizing. New plants were being built on the outskirts of the city, where land was cheap and transportation infrastructure was modern. The workers followed the jobs to the suburbs. The tax base followed the workers. The middle class followed the tax base. Detroit's population, which had peaked at nearly 2 million people in 1950, began a decline that would continue for decades. As people left, businesses closed. As businesses closed, more people left. It was a spiral, slow at first, then faster, then catastrophic. The smaller businesses in the Packard plant hung on through the 1970s and 1980s. Warehousing, storage, light industrial work. The building that had built cars for kings now stored surplus goods for companies few people had heard of. And then, in the 1990s, something shifted again. The rave scene found the Packard plant. I am not making this up. In the 1990s, Detroit was the birthplace of techno music. And in the vast, empty, echoing spaces of the abandoned Packard factory, underground DJs and promoters found the perfect venue.
Thousands of people, sometimes tens of thousands, would gather in those concrete halls where Merlin engines had once been assembled, where the Twin Six had once thundered to life, and dance until dawn. The legendary Spastic Party, hosted by DJ Richie Houghton, one of the most influential figures in electronic music history, was held here, inside the Packard plant, among the ruins of American industry. There is something almost poetic about that, something that says everything about how a nation processes loss. The place where American manufacturing reached its absolute peak became, in its death, the birthplace of a new kind of American art. But the raves couldn't last. The buildings were deteriorating. Pieces of the structure were falling. The city was increasingly concerned about safety. In 1994, the city of Detroit took ownership of the majority of the Packard property after the owners failed to pay back taxes. In 1999, believing that they owned the entire plant, the city evicted the remaining tenants and prepared for demolition. And then, because this story would not be complete with a legal twist, a court ruled that the city didn't actually own all of the plant. The legal title was contested. The demolition couldn't proceed. So the building just sat there, with no tenants, with no owner willing to take responsibility, with no plan. And it started to die. I need to describe for you what the Packard plant looked like in the years after abandonment, because words almost don't do it justice. Imagine walking into a building the size of a small city. Not one building, 80 buildings, connected by walkways and bridges and underground tunnels, sprawling across 80 acres of Detroit's east side. Now imagine that this complex has been empty for years.
That vandals have stripped everything of value, that scrappers have torn out the copper wiring, the pipes, the metal fixtures, that fires have broken out repeatedly, sometimes set deliberately, sometimes the result of vagrant activity, sometimes just the inevitable consequence of years of neglect in an unmaintained structure. The floors are covered in debris. Entire sections of upper floors have collapsed, creating mountains of broken concrete and twisted rebar in the rooms below. Trees are growing through the windows. Entire sections of the roof have given way, leaving the interior exposed to rain and snow and sun. And yet, despite everything, despite decades of abuse, neglect, theft, fire, and weather, the reinforced concrete structure that Albert Kahn had designed was still standing. Still standing. Think about what that tells you about the genius of that original design. The Packard plant became a destination, an international destination. Urban explorers came from across the world to photograph those spaces. Artists came to paint the walls, to create murals in the cavernous rooms, to document the strangely beautiful intersection of decay and grandeur. There was even a website, earnestly run by someone with a very specific sense of humor, that tracked whether the Packard plant was currently on fire. Not whether it had ever been on fire, not whether it might catch fire, whether it was, at this exact moment, actively burning.
Because the answer was frequently yes. Graffiti artists turned the walls into a gallery. Not just local artists, international street artists came here specifically to leave their mark on the most famous abandoned factory in the world.
The Packard plant became a canvas for some of the most extraordinary urban art ever created in the United States. And still, it kept deteriorating. By the early 2010s, most of the wiring and building materials that hadn't been stolen had been systematically dismantled by scrappers. In 2009, a group of urban explorers pushed a dump truck off the 4th floor, just to see what would happen. There were darker stories, too. Bodies were found in the complex. People who had been murdered elsewhere and dumped here. People who had died from exposure or accidents. In 2019, a 21-year-old man died after falling down an elevator shaft while playing hide-and-seek with friends in one of the extension buildings. The Packard plant had become a place where the city's most difficult realities gathered, where poverty and danger and history intersected in ways that were impossible to look away from and impossible to fully comprehend. It was a national embarrassment, and it was hauntingly, incomprehensibly beautiful. Both things were true at the same time. Now, I want to tell you about the bridge, because the bridge is important. In 1939, Packard built a bridge over East Grand Boulevard, the main street that runs through the complex, to allow completed car bodies to be transported between buildings during the assembly process. Unlike the utilitarian bridges that connected other buildings in the complex, this one had a decorative facade. It was beautiful. It became the most photographed element of the entire site.
The image that appeared on magazine covers, in documentaries, in the work of photographers from around the world. That bridge became the symbol of the Packard plant, the symbol of Detroit's industrial decay, the symbol of what happens when the greatest manufacturing nation on earth stops paying attention to its own foundations. In 2019, that bridge collapsed. Not dramatically, not in an explosion or a fire. It just fell. One day it was there, the next day it wasn't. Just a pile of concrete and rebar on East Grand Boulevard. When the bridge fell, something changed in Detroit's political calculus. The city had been dealing with the Packard plant's existence as an intractable problem for decades, a thing that was too large and too complicated and too legally entangled to solve. But when that bridge collapsed onto a public street, when the danger became impossible to ignore, city officials began to take a harder stance. But there was still the question of ownership. In 2013, a Peruvian investor named Fernando Palazuelo purchased the Packard plant at a tax foreclosure auction for $405,000. $405,000 for 3.5 million square feet of building, 80 acres of Detroit real estate. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. $405,000 for what was once the most advanced factory in the world, for the place where the cars of presidents were built, for the facility where 55,000 Merlin engines were assembled to help win World War II. $405,000, the price of a mid-range house in a mid-range American suburb. Palazuelo was not without ambition.
He announced plans, a $350 million rehabilitation project that would transform the plant into a multi-purpose campus, mixed use, residential, commercial, cultural spaces. People were skeptical, very skeptical. But Palazuelo began work. Slowly. He cleared out the administrative building, he hired construction crews, he held a groundbreaking ceremony in May 2017. He conducted the first public tours of the property. And for a moment, just a moment, it seemed like the story might have a different ending. Then, the money ran out. Or rather, it became clear that the money had never really been there in the quantities the plans required. By February 2021, Palazuelo's debts related to the Packard site alone sat at $820,000, nearly twice what he had paid for the entire property. 3 years of unpaid taxes, foreclosure proceedings on multiple parcels. In October 2020, Palazuelo announced that the original redevelopment vision had been abandoned. He would be selling the property. The dream, a genuine dream, in many ways a beautiful dream, was over. In 2021, the city of Detroit had seen enough. They filed a lawsuit against Palazuelo and his company, Arte Express, declaring the Packard plant a public nuisance and demanding demolition. In April 2022, a judge agreed and ordered Palazuelo to demolish all structures on the property. He did not comply. He missed every deadline. He pushed back at every step. And so the city took over. Mayor Mike Duggan stood in front of the ruins and said, "He is under court order to pay for this. We'll certainly go after every asset he has in America." A city of Detroit versus a Peruvian investor over the ruins of the greatest luxury car factory in American history.
This is the world's most famous abandoned factory. It cannot go quietly. In late 2022, the demolition finally began. $26 million in funding from the American Rescue Plan Act, the Federal Pandemic Relief Fund, $12 million more allocated by the Governor of Michigan. Phase by phase, building by building, the Adamo Group, a Detroit-based demolition contractor, moved through the site methodically, bringing down sections that had stood for over 100 years. By December 2024, the majority of the 3.5 million square foot complex had been removed. Gone. The concrete that Albert Kahn had poured in 1906, that had survived the Depression, 2 world wars, 50 years of abandonment, fires, floods, scrappers, urban explorers, drug operations, and decades of Detroit winters, was finally gone. 2 structures were preserved: the administrative building at 1580 East Grand Boulevard and the building at 1539 East Grand Boulevard. Together, about 230,000 square feet, roughly 6% of what had stood here at the peak. And he was right. And he was wrong. Because here's the thing. The Packard plant was not just an embarrassment. It was not just a problem to be solved. It was not simply blight to be removed. It was a mirror. For 60 years, the ruins of the Packard plant forced America to look at itself, to look at what happens when you build something extraordinary and then abandon it, when you chase short-term profits and ignore long-term foundations, when you let a city hollow out from the inside while the people who built it are told their labor is no longer needed. The Packard plant became famous around the world not because it was ugly, but because it was honest. Every crumbling wall, every collapsed floor,
Every piece of stolen copper wire, every photograph of a tree growing through a broken window, all of it was saying the same thing. This is what happens when you stop caring. This is what remains when the dream ends. This is the cost, the real, physical, concrete cost of abandoning the people and places that built you. Detroit is not unique in this. Rust Belt cities across America tell the same story. Industries moved, jobs disappeared, communities collapsed, and the buildings stood as testimony, not to failure, but to what was once here, to what was once built, to what was once worth something. But now we need to talk about what might come next, because this story isn't finished. Not a factory, not a warehouse, a park, with a new 400,000 square foot manufacturing facility, with a cultural center, with an indoor skate park, with public green space on land that has been a symbol of urban decay for 60 years. The developer is a team led by Bennett and co-developer Orrin Goldenberg, the same Goldenberg who recently transformed the former Lincoln plant into the mixed-use Dreamtroit development in Detroit's Northwest Goldberg neighborhood. There is a railroad spur that runs directly through the property, tracks that once connected the Packard plant to Detroit's freight rail network, reportedly still in usable condition. Urban designers are calling it a hidden gem, a potential connection to modern logistics operations that could bring real industrial activity back to East Grand Boulevard. Near GM's Factory Zero, near the Poletown Corridor, in a neighborhood that has been waiting for 68 years for someone to care about it again. Is this vision realistic? Maybe, maybe not. Detroit has seen many visions come and go.
Many groundbreaking ceremonies that led nowhere. Many promises that dissolved in the gap between ambition and financing. But something feels different now. The demolition is done. The legal battles are, mostly, settled. The land is cleared and available. The political will exists in a way that it didn't for decades. And there is something profoundly, almost unbearably symbolic about the idea that on the same ground where 40,000 workers built the American dream, where kings ordered cars and presidents rode in motorcades and pilots flew Merlin-engined P-51 Mustangs into the teeth of the Luftwaffe, there might be something new. Not the same, never the same. You cannot rebuild what was here. You cannot bring back those 40,000 workers. You cannot resummon the world where Packard was the American Rolls-Royce and every celebrity and head of state wanted one in their garage. But you can build something else. Something honest about what this city has survived. Something that honors the history without being imprisoned by it. Something that looks forward while acknowledging what the past cost. That is what cities do when they are truly alive. They grieve, they remember, and then, slowly, painfully, imperfectly, they find a way to go on. Let me tell you the things I want you to take away from this story. The Packard Motor Car Company was founded by a man who was told he couldn't build a better car, and responded by building the best car in the world. For 53 years, the factory on East Grand Boulevard was the physical expression of that defiance, a building that was itself a revolution in the use of concrete, in the design of industrial spaces, in the relationship between a workplace and the people who worked in it.
The workers who came through those gates every morning were not just factory workers. They were craftsmen, artists, engineers, people who practiced 80 different trades with a precision and pride that produced vehicles worthy of royalty. During the darkest years of the 20th century, those same workers set aside their car-building skills and built the engines that helped win a world war. 55,000 times, a Packard Merlin engine lifted a P-51 Mustang into the sky over Europe. 55,000 times, the people of East Grand Boulevard contributed directly to the defeat of fascism. And then the company made mistakes. Understandable mistakes. Human mistakes. The same mistakes that every great company eventually faces. The drift toward short-term thinking. The dilution of identity. The desperate merger that creates new problems instead of solving old ones. And the factory closed. And the city hollowed out. And the building stood in the rain for 60 years, being stripped and burned and photographed and mythologized. And now it's gone. Most of it. And something new might rise. The Detroit Packard Plant is many things. It is the story of American innovation at its most extraordinary. It is the story of industrial ambition on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend today. It is the story of the workers who built something extraordinary and were abandoned when the profit motive moved on. It is the story of a city that stared into its own darkest mirror for 60 years and somehow kept going. And it is the story, still unfinished, still uncertain, still alive, of whether America is capable of learning from its ruins. Ask the man who owns one. Ask him what it cost. Ask him if it was worth it.
If you've made it to the end of this video, thank you. Genuinely. These stories matter. The factories matter. The workers matter. The history matters. If this story moved you, if it made you think, subscribe to this channel, because we have more of these stories, more factories, more rises, more falls, more of the hidden history of the places that built the modern world. This is just the beginning.